This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins today's show with information about cases that involve the Clean Water Act and PFAS, both cases that could be impactful to agriculture. Continuing the show is K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz as he talks about starter fertilizer for corn and the effects of placement. K-State's Beef Cattle Institute finishes today's show as Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, Brian Lubbers, and Bob Larson answer questions about cattle from Dustin Pendell. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today wanting to talk about one of your recent blog articles, and one of the things within that article talks about the Clean Water Act. And so as we start off today's conversation, what is the Clean Water Act?
Well, the Clean Water Act has been around for a little bit more than a half a century. The major amendments were back in 1972. And for the point of our discussion today, which is very important to farmers, is that there is a permit discharge requirement before you can discharge a pollutant into the navigable waters of the United States. Now, the term pollutant is defined very broadly, and that can include sediment. It can include lots of things that we wouldn't necessarily think are pollutants. And so if that discharge permit requirement applies, which you have to have if you're discharging a pollutant from a point source into a navigable water, then that's very costly. It's time-consuming for farmers and ranchers. And so that's the main point of what we're going to get into today.
Thinking of these different farmers and ranchers and wanting to specifically look at a cranberry farming operation and how they're dealing with the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, there's a case that's been filed in late February this year, so it's a brand new case in Federal District Court, Western District of Wisconsin, against the cranberry operation. And in that case, they're arguing that an exemption that normally applies to agriculture should not apply in this instance. And what that exemption is known as the irrigation return flow exemption. So in other words, if I irrigate my farm fields and there are chemicals on my fields and through the process it gets into underground water and then might find its way into surface water, I don't have to have a permit for that because that's part of irrigation agriculture and that's exempted. That's not a direct discharge of a pollutant into a navigable water. It's by means of a process that it got there. And so by means of that irrigation process, it's exempted. Well, the claim in this case is that cranberry farming operations should not be able to use that exemption because they're not irrigating. And so by the strict construction of that term, it should not apply. But what happens here, and what the claim is that a channel and a ditch, which were next to this cranberry bog. Cranberries are raised in bogs and then drained. But because of a ditch and a channel that are nearby, the ditch and the channel serve as a point source discharge of phosphorus and sediment discharges into a nearby lake when the bogs are drained at harvest time for the cranberries. And phosphorus and sediment are pollutants under the Clean Water Act. And the claim is, well, that water is in the bogs is not used for irrigation. It's to aid in the overall growing process and protect the cranberries from freezing and harvesting. And so the irrigation return flow exemption should not apply.
And why is this something, while Kansas might not have cranberry operations, is still really important to the state?
Well, it's a big deal because depending on what the courts say in terms of the breadth of that exemption by definition applies to crop agriculture. So this is one, if you get a court here that broadly construes the application of this exemption and then wipes it out, then we become very concerned about that in terms of crop irrigation agriculture because then we'd lose the exemption. Now, I don't think that will happen because the exemption is statutory. And we're dealing with a construction of the statutory exemption by the agency here. So I don't think the court would strike it out of the statute. They have no authority to do that. But we worry about the possible breadth of any change to the irrigation return flow exemption. So not just cranberries, but rice production also would I would think would be right at this, because rice is grown very similarly in many respects to the way cranberries are grown. But this is one to keep on the radar, and we'll keep people informed as to where this is going. It just got filed in late February, so we're at the trial court stage on this. We haven't had a trial yet. It's set for trial, and then we'll have some time before the trial court decides it, and then I'm sure it'll be appealed. And so we've got a process to go through here, but it's an interesting one to watch.
And another case being watched and important to talk about, PFAS. And as we talk about PFAS, what are they? Well,
PFAS are really a widely used and long-lasting chemical that have components that break down slowly over time. They've been around since the 1940s, so it's nothing new. And they're found in water and air and soil all over the place, U.S. and other countries across the globe. And they're contained in many commercial and industrial products. The carpet in this studio that we're recording in right now probably has PFAS in it. And some studies have shown that PFAS may be linked to harmful health effects in humans and animals and cause various cancers and other health problems. And currently there's no known method for cleaning up PFAS contamination. Now, the biggest potential problem for agriculture will likely be biosolids, because biosolids have become a pretty cost-effective substitute for other types of fertilizer. Fertilizer prices have gone up significantly in recent years, and so biosolid use has actually increased as a result of this. And biosolids are the solid matter that remains at the end of a wastewater treatment process, and they're often land-applied. And farmers find benefits in land applying those, and they recycle nutrients and fertilizers and are cost-effective, as I mentioned.
And as farmers are finding benefits, there are also a few concerns that come with using biosolids.
Well, if the biosolids get contaminated with PFAS, those PFAS don't break down. And now you've got them on your soil. You've incorporated them into your crop rotation. The plants uptake that, and it's going to be there for quite some time. It could be you could harvest crops on land that you land applied the biosolids as fertilizer. Then you grow the crops, you feed them to your livestock. Then your livestock get contaminated. And if testing is done and it shows up, you can be shut down. And that's a really big concern for agriculture.
And there's a case that's an example of that.
Yeah, indeed. In 2022, there was a Michigan 400-acre cattle farm that was a century farm, so it's been in this family for over a century, and they were forced to shut down due to the presence of high levels of PFAS in their beef products from that operation and in the soil at their farm. Now, Michigan is one state that is aggressive in testing for the presence of PFAS, and that farm had received biosolids from a municipal wastewater treatment plant to fertilize their crops, and the farmer later harvested those crops and fed them to his cattle and created the problem. He can't sell the cattle. He can't sell the crops he would harvest from the farm. He's basically being bankrupted in place. And so he's claiming that, of course, he didn't know that the biosolids were contaminated. Testing wasn't done at the wastewater treatment plant. It was done after the fact. And so he had no knowledge of it. The wastewater treatment plant didn't have any knowledge of the contamination. And what they've done is trace it back to an auto parts supplier that released chromium into the wastewater system that allegedly contaminated the biosolids. And so he's seeking millions of dollars in punitive damages to help cover the cost of remediating his farm soil and groundwater. So, again, he's stuck until if the court were to decide in his favor. He's got major problems. And Kansas currently does not test for PFAS in wastewater, but that's not to say that they might not do that in the future.
And you've mentioned Michigan and where Kansas currently stands on this. And there's a recent case from early 2024 that involves Texas farmers.
Right. In late February, there's a group of Texas farmers that have had the same problem of contamination by PFAS in biosolids that they used on their farms. And the allegation against this company, this is a major manufacturer. They're a major biosolid provider for manufacturing, I should say. And the claim was they distributed contaminated biosolid-based fertilizer that was applied to these farms in Texas. And the claim is in this that the company either knew or should have known that it was putting a defective product in commerce, the contaminated biosolids. And you've got product defect claims and negligence claims and private nuisance nuisance claims. And so that's another one we're going to have to watch. That just more recently got filed in late February. So again, we'd have to go to the trial court, then we'd have obviously an appeal. So we're ways down the road on a resolution of this. But this PFA contamination or PFAS contamination issue is becoming a big deal for farmers and ranchers.
As we are talking about these different farmers and ranchers, wanting to mention that states do have different ways of dealing with PFAS.
Right. There are just a handful of states, and I mean literally one handful of states, 4 or 5 states that do aggressive testing for these. Kansas, as I said, is not one of those states, and Maine has taken pretty aggressive legislative action. They've actually banned the land application of biosolids and have set up a fund for impacted farmers. Other states are looking into providing compensation for disaffected farmers. So this is something that we're going to continue to watch in subsequent legislative sessions across the country next year. I don't think we'll see any more action this year. We're kind of late in most sessions for this year. But this is an issue that's going to be in the courts as well as in various state legislatures for the foreseeable future.
If people would like to read more on this topic and keep up to date as things come out, how can they do that?
You can access my blog off the homepage of my website, which is Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, also on the Ag Manager site here at K-State Ag Econ Department.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us some information about agricultural law.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. His blog article that talks about this is titled Property Rights Edition, Irrigation Return Flows, PFAS, and the Quiet Title Act. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it on Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR or on AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about starter fertilizer for corn. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, can you explain to us what is starter fertilizer?
Starter fertilizers is something that we define usually as a fertilizer that we apply typically at planting time. Tend to be a much lower rate of application, and the placement of this application also very important. It needs to be basically close proximity to the seed. So again, it is something we'll do at planting time, typically with a planter, and we have some different options for the specific placement. And again, the main goal here is really to help a little bit as, basically as we are talking about starter, we really to get that crop early growth and early in the season to see some growth response and hopefully get that crop to a good start, basically. And it is something that can be quite important for crops like corn in particular, where we tend to apply plant earlier in the season, maybe lower soil temperature, and having some of that available fertilizer in close proximity can make a big difference in terms of that early establishment, and hopefully, again, that translating to good growing conditions the rest of the season and good yields.
And what nutrients are usually associated with starter fertilizer?
When we talk about starter fertilizers, we tend to think more typically for phosphorus. That's typically one of the nutrients that we tend to apply more consistently in starter fertilizers. There are some reasons for that. Phosphorus is a nutrient that can help with early growth development, root development and establishment. And of course, it is an immobile nutrient, so having that phosphorus in close proximity to the growing roots is very important. And so again, that's one of the reasons why we think about phosphorus primarily. However, that early growth and establishment that we tend to see, the starter effect, if you will, is not just due to phosphorus, but we also basically getting the benefit of that nitrogen nutrient in close proximity. So it's really those two nutrients, primarily phosphorus and also nitrogen, are the ones that are providing that early growth and establishment benefit that we see in starter fertilizers in corn.
And as people are applying starter fertilizer, a few different ways that placement can be done. And the first one to talk about today, pop-up.
We have, like I mentioned earlier, different options for application. Pop-up or in-furrow application is one of those that is fairly popular. And in this placement, we essentially put in the fertilizer in contact with the seed. So basically putting in the same row, and again, it's essentially there in contact with the seed. There are other placements that is very common and popular as well. Kind of the traditional, I guess, over the years has been used what's called the 2x2, which is putting the fertilizer on the side and below the seed, so it's away from the seedling. And then one that's also get a lot of, is widely used is surface dribble, and so that's basically dribbling liquid fertilizer typically behind the closing wheels, slightly on the side. And so those are maybe the three more popular options that we see more often. But going back to the first one that you mentioned, the pop-up fertilizer, there are some things that we need to consider there, because this is a situation where the fertilizer is in contact with the seed. We have some limitations in terms of the rate of application, the source of fertilizer that we can apply, because we can get in a situation where we have basically a seedling damage due to high application rates, or, for example, if we're putting UAN, we may have some ammonia toxicity coming from that urea. And so that's one application method that is quite good, but also has some limitations. And so typically, if we're thinking about maximum rate of application in pop-up application methods, typically we say no more than 6 to 8 pounds of nitrogen plus potassium. And we're talking about those two nutrients in particular, nitrogen and potassium. And in a 30-inch row spacing, again, 6 to 8 pounds total is the maximum application rate. The reason for this is because obviously we're putting more. We basically may cause some seedling damage, typically because of the high salt concentration near the seedling, and again, causing damage there to the seedling. I mentioned also UAN, and UAN is something that we'll typically not recommend to apply in a pop-up in-furrow application, because we do have some urea. And urea, in the process of conversion from urea to ammonium, we have ammonia, which is typically toxic to the seedling. And so that's something that we typically will not recommend. If we're thinking about pop-up in-furrow, we'll not recommend to put any UAN in that mix.
For people who are wanting to do pop-up placement, how does their soil type impact how many pounds they should apply?
Typically, in that range that I mentioned, 6 to 8 pounds, if we are in a sandy soil situation, we'll use the lower end of that, so typically no more than 6 pounds. If we are in a fine, medium texture soil, we can go up to 8 pounds of application. And the reason for this is because if you have a more fine texture soil, the CEC of that soil, and oftentimes also with better organic matter content, make it that condition a little bit safer, right? In the case of a sandier soil, there's higher risk of seeing that basically seedling damage due to that high salt concentration, basically causing the plasmosis issue, if you will, in the new seedlings.
And wanting to talk about those other placement options as well, 2x2 and surface dribble.
Yes, those are good alternatives. Like I say, traditionally we talk a lot about 2x2. One of the disadvantages of the 2x2 application method is that we basically need to have extra attachment to the planters to be able to do this placement. And so that's been a challenge, especially we're talking about bigger planters, and, just keep adding more attachments to it. It's a little bit of a challenge. So, and then we have the dribble on the surface, which, like I say, essentially is dribble in the fertilizer, liquid fertilizer behind the closing wheel, so you don't need any additional attachment. But both of these placement methods, 2x2 and dribble on the surface, provide some advantage in terms of application rates, that we can basically go much higher with application rates without having the issues that we are seeing in the case of the pop-up methods. These two options are excellent if we are thinking about maybe putting a little bit more nitrogen. Now in this kind of situation, we can definitely put some UAN. And so if we're thinking about complementing the overall fertility with higher rates of nitrogen, or simply just putting higher volumes of fertilizer and higher rates of say 10-34-0, for example, we can easily do that with 2x2 and surface dribble, and again getting the same benefit. One of the things in the case of the surface dribble that is often a question is that in the case of phosphorus in particular, we're talking about a nutrient that is not mobile, and so we always question whether or not this phosphorus is going to be available to the roots, given that we're putting on the surface. And one thing to keep in mind here is that because we are, in the case of 1034O, or even better if we're putting some UAN in the blend, having that combination of both nitrogen and phosphorus will actually favor some mobility of that phosphorus. So some of that phosphorus, especially the soluble form of phosphorus, is going to move in the root zone, and we do see the same type of response that we will see in 2x2 application methods. Also, just to emphasize here, typically we're talking about higher volumes of application, and so that's also something that's important. We just put in more volume, and by doing that dribble on the surface, again, we just essentially moving some of that liquid a little bit in the soil already. And so that's a big advantage that we have with these options of 2x2 and surface dribble. Again, just a lot more flexibility in terms of application rates, type of fertilizer that we can put, which is something that is a limiting in the case of in-furrow, where, again, we really have to be watching very closely how much we're putting, and especially, again, what source of fertilizer because of the potential salt damage.
And Dorivar, what role does starter fertilizer play when it comes to other fertility management?
One thing that I often think about, especially in the context of nitrogen, is that for maybe those producers who are doing most of the nitrogen apply as a side dress, starter fertilizers and having some nitrogen in the starter fertilizer is even more relevant, because that may be the only source of nitrogen that the corn is going to see early in the early few weeks until the side dressing. And so that's something also to keep in mind, again, for those doing side dressing, or even in the case of those using primarily anhydrous until the roots actually get to that nitrogen applied with anhydrous. The starter fertilizer is providing a lot of that nutrient, especially in the case of nitrogen. And so, again, those are situations where we can see even more benefit from starter fertilizers, especially nitrogen in the starter.
Dorivar, any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our growers?
One of the things that we need to also keep in mind when it comes to the starter fertilizer is that it's an excellent opportunity to apply other nutrients. Again, we talk a lot about phosphorus and nitrogen here, but again, it's an excellent opportunity to put micronutrients. Again, especially because we're talking about low rates of application for some of the micronutrients, for example, zinc, and this will be a very efficient way of putting those nutrients. Remember, if we're thinking about just a few pounds of application of zinc that perhaps we need, something like broadcast application will not be very effective. And again, doing an application with a starter fertilizer is an excellent opportunity. We also do get other nutrients like sulfur, for example, where application rates are not very high. Of course, we have to be careful in the case of in-furrow application for sulfur. But if we're doing 2x2 or dribble on the surface, we can easily apply also nutrients like sulfur and even chloride in some cases where we need chloride. And so again, just think about those options, and take advantage of the opportunity basically to complement any other nutrients that we need in lower volumes that we can do easily with a starter fertilizer.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about starter fertilizer.
Thank you.
That was K-State Soil Fertility Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. I will link an Agronomy e-update article that talks about this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we finish our Wednesday show with a segment of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. This week, we're joined by K-State's Dustin Pendell, Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, and Brian Lubbers.
So if you recall from, I guess, the last time we asked questions, right, the USDA, they released their Ag Census 2022 Ag Census numbers back in February. And we asked you some questions. I'm guessing I could probably ask those same questions today, and we still might get the same responses as last time, would be my guess.
I doubt I would answer the same thing.
What's funny is I don't even, if I asked you them, I can't remember what I asked last time.
And we don't remember our answers.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're all good.
Yeah. Luckily, I did write down what I asked. I won't ask them again today. But last time, what we did talk about is just some of the kind of the introduction land, average size farms, how many farms in general, the numbers from 2017 compared to the most recent one, and then some cow-calf numbers as well. This time I want to continue on within the cattle, but we move to the feedlot sector. So we'll just talk some numbers with the feedlot sector. So just to recap, beef cows with farms, the number of farms between 2017 and 2022 declined by about 15%, just to keep that. Talk about cattle on feed, so feedlots. Any guesses how the 2017 to 2022 numbers up, down, how much, either way?
I'm going to say inventory or talking, number of yards?
No, we're talking farms.
Number of operations.
Operations.
Yep.
Yeah, yards.
Down. I'm going to say down.
Down.
How much?
I'm going to go, I think I might be high, but I'm going to say 15%.
I was going to say 10.
I'll say 10.
12%. So pretty close.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, between us. We're down.
But I'm closer.
So there's 22,600 yards. And then they break it down between farms, like by inventory. So the first inventory is 1 to 19 head. And actually, that's the only category that actually went up.
That's what I was thinking you were asking earlier.
No. Largest ones are 2,500 or more. They're pretty much, it only went down by like 6 yards. So not much.
The intermediate ones are the ones that really.
It's the 2,500, 1,000 to 2,500 head were the ones that went down the most. So talk spatially for a moment. This is an easy question here, but what are the states that have the most number of feed yards? The 3 states, top 3.
I do think I know this one.
Yeah. Nebraska, Kansas, Texas.
Yeah.
And what in that?
Oh no. Texas, Nebraska, Kansas.
Yeah, I think that's the right order.
Nope, you're right there. So this one I would have never have guessed, but change gears to custom feed yards. So there was a 20% decline in custom feeding between that time frame as well, in terms of the number of farms, not inventory. What states have the most custom feed yards? This one I would have had no clue.
I feel like Iowa. Iowa needs to be in there.
I think Nebraska.
Iowa and Nebraska would be.
I'm going to agree with you.
How many are we guessing, Dustin?
Just one, because that's all I wrote down.
Oh, okay. So you're asking which yard has the most? Which state
has the most yards, custom feeding yards?
Yeah. I'll go with Iowa.
Yeah.
I'm going to say Nebraska.
Iowa, 155 yards. In terms of inventory for custom, what state's going to have the most?
Texas.
They're third.
I'll say Kansas.
Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas. So it's just kind of reversed.
Okay. Interesting.
We did see some states that had increased number of feed yards, so operations. I never would have guessed it, but they're all in the Northwest.
Yeah, I would have said Idaho.
Washington, Oregon, and Idaho were the ones that went down would have been Iowa or Minnesota, kind of Iowa, South Dakota, Illinois would have been where declines were. So
kind of a continually shifting feeding industry as far as, you go back several decades and it was focused in Iowa and Illinois, kind of moved away.
Now it's kind of moving maybe a little bit more towards the west a little bit, but seeing similar trends not only in the feed yards, but as is what we saw when we talked about last time with the cow-calf operations.
So is the Northwest shifting to more feed grains production up there as opposed to like wheat and...
Yeah, I'm not sure on that. That's a good question, though. Something maybe to look into.
Excellent. Thanks, Dustin. Appreciate you sharing that. It's interesting to see how that industry trend kind of moves along with what we're seeing on the cow side. We've definitely seen some changes. We used to think about the cattle cycle going up and down, but it doesn't do the same pattern as it has in the past. So thanks for sharing that information with us.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.